This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. Haven't you ever felt that you could be a great mayor? You're smart, most likely smarter than most, informed and passionate about issues. So why not become a candidate and run for mayor of New York City? That's what Tom Allon decided last year. And now he's my guest. And where are you? What happened?
Well, I ran for about 20 months, and I accomplished a lot of what I wanted to, which was get the education issue forefront in the debate. I made a lot of friends, and I think I got a lot of issues out there, but I then decided about a month ago that I had to really focus on my livelihood and my family. And running for office is sort of a rich man's game, especially if you're running for mayor these days. So I decided that I had to focus on my career.
But you know, I mean, it's not an impossible dream.
Sure.
You know, I agree. I mean, when you called, I said yes. I always felt guilty because I never really supported you, but you were, haven't supported anybody. But anyway,
sure.
But yes, you should, because there's always that chance and that hope that a candidacy like that's going to catch on.
Absolutely.
Now, Sal Albanese, who's a dear friend of mine,
Sure.
we had lunch, and he said, I'm going to run for mayor. I thought, that's a great idea. Why doesn't it catch on in this city?
Well, I mean, there are definitely a lot of entrenched interests in the city. You know, it's a lot easier to run for office once you're in office because you can dispense favors and get donations from people who need zoning variances or need your help on a project. I encountered that on many occasions where people said, I'd love to donate money to you, Tom, but I'm afraid of pissing off Christine Quinn, or when he was running for mayor, Scott Stringer, the borough president. People are concerned, they want to back somebody, or they're concerned about backing somebody who might piss off the people who could hurt them in the short term.
Well, what are we going to do about that?
Well, I think we need to change. I mean, campaign finance is a better system now than it was 10 years ago. It allows people like me to run for office. There's still a huge bar to get campaign finance funds. You have to raise $250,000 in very small donations.
If you're running for mayor.
If you're running for mayor. You know, in smaller offices like city council and borough president, it's a little bit easier. You know, listen, I think that there's room for people like me to run for office who, you know, who are coming from outside of politics. Mike Bloomberg did it. Obviously, he had the benefit of wealth and 9/11 and Rudy Giuliani. So there is a precedent here for people coming outside the system.
But you have to have you really have to either have a persona that is so famous, right, that everybody knows.
It helps. I mean, listen, you know, it's funny because about a week before I pulled out of the race, I was at an event that actually my company, City and State, sponsored, and there was a woman there named Esther Fuchs, who actually was one of Mike Bloomberg's advisors on his first campaign. And I went over, and she was standing actually with another woman who at first I didn't recognize. And she said, you know, Tom, I hear you're doing very well in the debates. How's it going? And I said, you know, if debates were the only determinant of who becomes next mayor, I think I'd have a very good shot. But unfortunately, running for mayor is a rich man's game, and I'm not a rich man. The woman next to her sort of winced, walked away a couple minutes later, and I said, who was that? And she said, it's Mike Bloomberg's sister, Marjorie Tiven. And she was very lovely, and I don't think she took offense. But Mike Bloomberg, you know, there was a perfect storm in 2001. You know, it looked like Mark Green was going to be mayor up until October of 2001. But then between Mike's money, between 9/11, between Rudy Giuliani's popularity, all those things allowed him to become the next mayor.
But it's still, that's true, and he did have all this money. But I remember years ago I ran for borough president. And why I ran, I have no idea, except that Percy Sutton, who was running for mayor at the time, and the sitting borough president, called and asked if I'd run his campaign. And I thought to myself, well, if he wants me to run his campaign, why don't I run for his old office, right? So David Dinkins was the only candidate that was announced, and he had been the city clerk. He wasn't the city clerk yet. He was I don't know what he. Anyway, a district leader. I knew that.
Sure.
So I announced, and I ran, and then Bobby Wagner, who was running for mayor, he dropped down to run for that, and then Andy Stein dropped down, and they all had a lot of money. But more than that, there's that word that goes around
Sure.
to that one group that's just all around, right? It includes
Absolutely.
the people in the press.
The insiders and the media have a huge, listen, the word long shot and was attached to my name from the beginning. And there's no reason why the media should have said that from the start, at least 20 months out, because Mike Bloomberg was a long shot, Barack Obama was a long shot, and there's enough history that shows that long shots actually come in. But the narrative starts taking shape, and then all of a sudden the media treats you like a long shot, and then
you have to people treat,
and then other people, and that affects your ability to fundraise. And and then I never forget, the thing that hurt me the most during the campaign was Sam Roberts did a piece in the New York Times about the fact that there's no Jewish candidates for mayor this year. Well, my parents were Holocaust survivors, and I went to yeshiva as a kid. So I wrote him a note saying, Sam, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I'm actually Jewish and I'm running for mayor. And then they inserted in the piece that no major candidates for mayor were Jewish. Well, why the New York Times gets to decide who's major, who's not major is really not fair.
So what can we do about this?
I think you have to keep on fighting.
Because we're not producing great candidates.
We're not producing great candidates. I mean, that's why I jumped in 2011, because I felt that the field needed an alternative. It needed somebody who really understood the problems of public education in the city, somebody who understands the problems of business and inequality in the city. And again, I think I injected a lot of ideas into this race, so I feel very good about what I did. Listen, a lot of times in politics, many people who run the first time don't win. Mike Bloomberg is probably the exception to the rule. But going back to people like Ronald Reagan and many others, people sometimes win their second time out. So I'm very comfortable knowing that I think I'm 50 years old. I believe that I can run in 4 years or 8 years and be a very strong candidate then.
So what are you going to run for? Mayor again?
Maybe. It depends on whether it's, if this mayor, the next mayor, is not doing the job that I want that person to do, and the city feels the same way, then I would not rule out the possibility of doing something.
Also, the political parties. I mean, you ran as a Republican.
First as a Democrat, then Republican,
right? Why? First as a Democrat, because you're a Democrat.
Yeah,
basically.
I was a Democrat my whole life.
Right.
So I'm not a big believer in the two-party system. I believe there should be nonpartisan elections. Because
in the city or?
Everywhere. I mean, I do believe, I think one of the problems democracy has is that putting people into a Democratic or Republican camp is a shortcut and allows people to become lazy and not really sort of become concerned citizens about what these people really stand for. Because nobody's a pure Democrat, no one's a pure Republican, whatever that means. So you have to unfortunately pick one or the other, which I think eliminates 60 or 70% of the people from actually focusing on what you're actually saying, because they pigeonhole you then into a belief system which may be true for your beliefs and may not be. I've always been a social liberal. And I realized halfway through the campaign that fiscally I'm probably more moderate to maybe even a little bit conservative, because I do believe that government should be smaller. I do believe that we have to figure out a way to bring taxes down the city, because it's hard to, to live in New York, even as a middle-class person or upper-middle-class person, if you're being taxed to death, and that's why a lot of people are moving out of the city. So I then decided, you know what, I'm having a very hard time being heard on the Democratic side of things. I do actually feel that some of my belief system does fall into the Republican Party. There is a precedent for mayors winning on a fusion ticket. I was very lucky and very pleased to get the Liberal Party to support me very early. Early in the race, they gave me their endorsement.
Before you went to the Republican line?
Before I went to the Republican line. In January of 2011, I met a number of times with the Liberal Party leaders and made a strong pitch. And I think fundamentally I'm actually a liberal, which is very different from being a Republican and being a Democrat. And the Liberal Party in New York City has a very proud history. It goes back to Roosevelt back in the 40s. It was created then. And it has elected some very progressive leaders in New York, from LaGuardia to Lindsay to Javits to Rockefeller. So the Liberal Party for me really was the place that I felt the most comfortable. So a fusion ticket of a Republican and a liberal worked for Giuliani, worked for Bloomberg, worked for Lindsay. I was hoping to recreate that.
But your dream of reinvigorating the Liberal Party didn't happen.
It did, because
in a way.
Well, I mean, again, when I said before that I accomplished much of what I set out to do, I made education an important issue in this campaign, and I made a Liberal Party a vigorous party again. Right now, Joe Lhota and John Catsimatidis are fighting for that line.
Oh, that's interesting.
And if any Republican is going to win in New York, they need a Liberal Party line. So I think I helped revive that party.
I'm sort of an expert on the Liberal Party.
Yes, I know you are.
My first time at the polls when I was 16 years old. I was a poll watcher for the Liberal Party because I had an uncle who was one of the founders.
Who was that?
He wasn't famous, Al Myers.
Sure.
So I went to the headquarters, was on 89th and Broadway, and they gave me a thing, and I went over to the poll, and there I was, and I loved it. You know, somebody came back, a young man came back, and asked if I was a Labor Party watcher because he was interested in asking me out for a date, but he didn't want to have some Labor Party, which was, of course, an interesting split. You know,
Exactly.
The Liberal Party was started by unions.
It was sort of means. I mean, the Liberal Party, the interesting, you know, the motto the Liberal Party's had for many years is the Liberal Party was created to keep the Democrats honest
against Tammany.
And the Republicans liberal.
Right, and they didn't want Tammany, and they wanted to support Roosevelt, so they formed the Liberal Party.
And the Liberal Party was always the party of good government. I mean, one of the reasons I became dissatisfied and disgusted with the Democratic Party is if you know, one party rule never works. And if you look back at the last 10 years in New York City government and New York State government, there's been over 20 people indicted who were public officials. That's a higher rate than in many poor parts of the city.
And the parties have existed basically to name judges and get in trouble.
Yeah, that's why I think nonpartisan elections is the way to go.
That's an interesting kind of thing. The Liberal Party, the only time, or as long as we're on the Liberal Party, the Liberal Party split. It was started actually as the Labor Party.
Yes.
And then they they thought it was too communist, so they went over to the Liberal Party. You know, always that Red Scare always confused me because I never understood exactly what it was all about. But anyway.
The Liberal Party is a great brand, and I hope we can bring it back.
Yeah, and then in Lindsay days, when he ran and lost the Republican primary, he ran on that line and an independent line, but it was that line. So after that, we had a task force that used to meet all the time, Alex Rose and everything.
Right.
And I was the staff for that task force. So that goes all in circles.
Well, in 1969, it elected a mayor.
Right. And they were responsible, incidentally, for one of the first primary races for a judicial spot. There was a Supreme Court, it wasn't a Supreme Court, it was the, what do you call the court that does, the surrogates court. And both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party endorsed the same judge. And somebody then, Jimmy Wexler wrote a column, he was in the New York Post, and the Post was very liberal in those days. And he wrote that Costello was, that the candidate was connected to Costello, who was a mafia, a gangster. And Alex Rose showed that we had been trying to get Robert Kennedy to run this primary race with the reformers. Alex Rose showed Kennedy that article, and that's what started. And Sam Silverman then ran in the primary and won as the surrogate.
Oh, interesting.
It's so a whole long thing. I don't mean to be talking.
No, but the Liberal Party.
But the party system is one of the basic problems here.
One of the basic problems.
It does not produce good talent.
It doesn't. It produces.
And it plays no role.
Right, and what you've got is people who play chutes and ladders, of what I call it in politics. They look for the next available office so they can move up.
Well, it's become a career. You start it here and you move up and up and up. And
I mean, people said to me,
distortion of what it should be.
When I announced, a lot of people said, why don't you start out at city council or borough president?
Wait your turn.
And I said, you know what, I'm not that young. And I'm really not interested in being a career politician. I'm interested in being a public servant, and that's really, to me, the most important issue in the city right now is public education. And I felt that my background and experience in fixing public education is what the city needs right now. So that's why.
Let's talk about public education.
Sure.
Why is it so? Why do we have all these different perspectives, different pressures, different tests, different this and everything else?
I mean, the amazing thing is, and I don't want to sound glib. There's one very basic fix that we can make, and I said this a lot on the campaign trail, and finally people started listening, and I think some of the candidates picked up on this. I was a teacher at Stuyvesant High School 25 years ago. It was my first job. I taught at the high school that I graduated from 6 years earlier. Teachers in New York and in America leave the profession, 50% of them leave the profession within 5 years. If you had that kind of turnover in medicine, if you had that kind of turnover in law, we'd be talking about malpractice. But in teaching, we turn over 1 out of 2 teachers within 5 years. There was a report, back in the 1900s, early 1900s, when there was rising morbidity rates in New York, the Carnegie Endowment issued a report that said we need to change the way we train doctors. Doctors need 3 years of clinical training before they've gone to the operating room, before they start treating patients. And that changed the way we train doctors. And obviously, we're all the beneficiaries of that now that we're living longer.
They're changing it now, but it's all right. We'll talk about that another time.
100 years later, in 2010, the National Association that accredits education programs in the country, Blue Ribbon Panel, Randy Weingarten, many other important educators, issued a report saying we have to do the exact same thing for teachers. Teachers need 3 years of classroom experience, clinical training before they actually become full teachers. the report has been largely ignored. If we, really, because the villains, I believe, in public education are not teachers, they're not even the Department of Education. It is the schools of education that are not properly training teachers before they get into the classroom. I was a teacher, I had no classroom training before I walked in the classroom. I walked in, and all of a sudden I stood before 35 kids who relied on me to motivate them, inspire them, teach them, and you have to do it 5 times a day. As my old friend Frank McCourt said, it's the toughest job you'll ever have. 5 shows a day with a tough audience. We have to train teachers before they get in the classroom, and then once they're in the classroom, they need relentless training and mentoring. You need master teachers, people who have risen through the ranks, to then train younger teachers, and then we won't have people leaving within 5 years.
And we also need to respect them more, don't we?
Absolutely.
That's a basic problem.
Listen, I remember when I became a teacher 25 years ago, I actually was an aspiring journalist. And I worked during the week as a teacher, and on weekends I worked at the New York Times as a clerk. And there was a woman about my age sitting there one night. She goes, I don't see you during the week here. What do you do? And I said, well, I'm actually a high school English teacher. She goes, really? She looked at me sort of like I was pathetic. And that's the way we view teachers in our society. And it's the way we pay them, and it's the way we treat the whole system.
And they have the most important function.
They are the most important function.
Other than parents.
Exactly. And so everything else about public education, all the wars about charter schools, co-location, teacher evaluations, it's all a dodge. We have to focus on training teachers, because if you have a great teacher in a classroom, we've all known it. We've all experienced it as students, as parents. If your kid's in a class with a teacher who knows how to motivate them and teach them, they thrive. And that's really the way to fix it.
When I was in the city council, my 7th grade civics teacher from Joan of Arc Junior High School came as my guest, Herbert Eben. And if it hadn't been for Herbert Eben, I don't know if I would have, you know, gone along with what I was interested in.
And so I think that's the fundamental issue. And again, I think it's not just a city problem; it's a national problem.
So what do the unions say about that?
You know, I went to see Michael Mulgrew about 1.5 years ago when I jumped into the race, because I was very passionate about mentor teachers and master teachers. And I said, Michael, is there a program in the city where there are mentor teachers that, he said, you know, Tom, we've tried it in 33 schools, it failed in 32 of them, but there's one school out in Brooklyn called the New American Academy. It's a public school. I'm going to introduce you to the principal out there. He's a very smart guy. I went out to Brooklyn the next week, Crown Heights, very poor neighborhood. 99% of the kids are on school lunch programs. And there's a principal there, his name is Shimon Warnker, an Orthodox Jewish man who has a school that is poetry. If you walk in there, you realize you're in this incredible place. There's 4 levels of teacher, apprentice teachers, partner teachers, and then eventually master teachers. They work in teams of 4. And the master teachers get paid $125,000 a year, and they mentor the other 3 teachers on that team. The school is beautiful. The kids are inspired. They're learning beautifully. It works.
So is it a public school?
It's a public school.
Well, how does that happen?
I don't know exactly how Shimon Warnker did this. And the fact is that Shimon Warnker happens to be a protege of Joel Klein. The last time Joel Klein and Michael Mulgrew agreed about anything was probably never. So it's amazing that Shimon does this. He puts all of his money into the classroom. He has very little administration in the school. There's a secretary and a business manager, and everything else is about classroom.
So why can't it? Who's responsible for it not expanding?
Talk to Mr. Walcott, the chancellor. I mean,
is that who you talk to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, listen, even Michael Mulgrew likes this program. So I'm not sure why we're not scaling this around the city. Shimon Warnker should be a principal emulated by other principals around the city, and we can learn a lot from him. Not only does he do that, but he has the kids come from 8 to 9:30 every morning. There's no classes. The kids have to have breakfast for the first 45 minutes, half of them, and the other half goes to gym, and they swap. What do the teachers do? They plan their lesson plans from 8 to 9:30 as groups of 4, and they work together. It's a beautiful school. I suggest everybody look at it.
You know, I've always wondered, you become a teacher, so what do? You get your master's degree in education. Is that 1 year or 2 years?
It is.
Depending where you are.
It depends. I mean, again, you can study as an undergraduate and then become a teacher, and then you can get your certification afterwards. But it's, again, it's all about getting classroom experience, because the theory that you're learning up at Columbia or at Teachers College or at Bank Street is not enough to make you a good teacher.
But if you're teaching a specific subject, how do you get to be an expert in that subject? That's always wondered. That's what is always, I don't understand.
Hopefully you've either majored in that subject in college or in graduate school. But that's why
That's not necessarily true.
It's not necessarily true, and that's why you have sometimes people teaching math who were, history majors in college and vice versa. We need to focus more on getting teachers prepared.
It's more, though. It's more than just going to see the chancellor. I mean, it's really,
No,
as you're right, you're the mayor
right. You have to set the
and the
tone.
city council
Exactly. I mean,
and the newspapers
Right.
and the parents
Right.
and everybody to do it.
listen, and that's, I think, that's about 50 to 75% of the problem, is making sure teachers are well prepared. Then you've got the physical plant of the schools. You know, you walk into public schools around the city, they're dilapidated, the facilities are horrible, they were built in the 19th.
They're no longer what you need in the neighborhood. I mean, the neighborhood changes, but the physical building doesn't.
You have these schools that have been there for 50, 100 years.
they've not-
You know, one of the ideas that I proposed during the campaign, which seemed to also get some resonance, is that many of the schools in the city are sitting on valuable real estate. You know, my daughter goes to a public school on 84th and Columbus. It's a two-story building, crappy auditorium, crappy facilities, but it's sitting on one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in New York. Why don't we sell the air rights?
That's a very controversial subject now, isn't it?
Selling
and
air
some
rights?
of the parents and people are against it. Why?
I don't know why they're against it. Maybe they're concerned about the neighborhood becoming too
Or
crowded.
that's going to add more people.
It's going to add more people.
And where do the kids go while they're doing the building?
Yeah, I mean, listen, those are all valid concerns, but all this stuff is workable. But in order to get 21st century schools that have proper broadband, technology, gyms, you know, facilities that you need for kids to learn, and more seats, because the biggest problem in New York also is overcrowding in the schools. And we need to come up with a real estate solution to that overcrowding. 35 kids in a class is not necessarily conducive. Listen, when parents send their kids to private schools, they're not doing it just because they want to spend money. It's because the class size is 15 kids in a class, and the facilities are generally much better. I sent one of my children to a private school for high school. He got into Bronx Science, and I decided to send him to another school because I knew that he would have much more attention in a class of 15 than he would in a class of 35.
All right, so Tom, what's the Carnegie Foundation doing now? Are they doing any more funding like this or work to do this?
One would hope so. I don't really know.
You don't know?
I don't
So
really
you
know.
haven't gone to look for it?
No, I mean, I'm involved in sort of some of these education issues, but right
You're
now,
not organizing
right now
it.
I'm focused on my business.
But it's so frustrating because you see it nationally also. I mean, you see the lack of money up front when we know it's the most important, early childhood, and it goes right through. And then you see the prisons, and then you see the crime, and then you see all these other problems.
What's the definition of insanity? You know, doing the same thing over
Yeah.
and again and hoping for a different result.
Yeah.
You know, we've been, for 40 to 50 years now, our public education, and we wonder why this country is starting to decline. We're not preparing our kids for the jobs of the 21st century. And there's a number of different areas that we have to focus on. Vocational education, you know, not every
all that
kid,
stuff.
not
Yeah.
every kid has to go to a 4-year liberal arts college. There's a lot of other fixes, but we need somebody as mayor and as chancellor in the city who understands the nuances of the
So
problem.
does that school in Brooklyn cost more money than other schools?
No.
No.
Actually, he has the same budget everybody else does.
Let's talk about what you're doing now.
Sure.
What are you doing now?
So I was the president of a media company for the past 10 years called Manhattan Media. I built a company.
Which is a company, and what you did was certainly an important part of your life and background
Sure.
and credentials for running for mayor.
It was. I mean, I've helped build a public company back in the 90s. And in 2001, I privatized part of that company and built it with a couple of private equity partners. And now I'm
But
on-
what you did, the local reporting is what I
Yeah, thank you. No, we did some great journalism. You know, listen,
All
I've been
these
in,
local
I've been in,
newspapers.
yeah, I was at once vice president of a company that had papers all over the city. In the last 10 years, it was all in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've decided in the past month, since I have 3 kids I got to put through college, is to focus on one division of that company. So I did a management buyout of a publication called City and State, which focuses on the government industry. It's a very well-respected, twice-monthly newspaper. It has a daily email called First Read, which everybody in government reads, including the mayor, including the governor. And then we do a series of public policy forums. I believe it has a lot of potential to grow. I hope it does because, again, my kids have to go through college. but it has a huge amount of influence because the mayor said actually at one of our events recently that First Read is now his second read every morning after Bloomberg News. So this is a way I believe that I can have a voice in the public policy debate in this city, whether it's on education issues or on transportation issues or inequality issues, because we do public policy forums on all these topics. We do issues that are focused on some of the important issues of the day, and First Read is something that sets the agenda every morning for the people in
And
power.
what's the website?
It's cityandstateny.com. And if people go to that website, it's city, A-N-D-S, state, NY.com, they can sign up for something called First Read, which is in your inbox every morning at 6:45 a.m. It's in there, and within 5 minutes you can scroll and see all the important news of the day in politics.
And you see what's happening, the issues and the hearings and the, and the speeches.
It's become a must-read.
And then you see whose birthday it is.
Exactly.
And what the latest gossip is.
Exactly. It's a great, every day I meet people in the city who say, it's the first thing I look at when I'm bleary-eyed in the morning after I get out of bed. We know the governor reads it, we know the mayor reads it, so people in power read it.
And what are the 2 publications that come out?
Well, it's called City and State.
And how do you subscribe to that?
Again, online, people can do that at our website, City and State NY. It's mailed to every elected leader's home and office, as well as lobbyists and people involved in government, commissioners and agency heads. People can subscribe. It's where we do more long-form journalism. The next issue will have a cover story about the future leaders of the Republican Party around New York State. The last issue was about the Long Island Power Authority and how Governor Cuomo, he may be blaming the people who ran it, but he was actually in charge for 2 years and didn't replace those people. So we do some hard-hitting investigative journalism there.
And other than education, what other issues are you really?
Am I focused on?
Yeah.
I mean, really, to me, the 2 things are education and inequality, and they're linked, in jobs. Because I think, listen, fundamentally, if we get the education part of the equation, and by the way, education is not just about kids. It's about, we need to be lifelong educators in this city.
And start earlier.
Start earlier, but also people have to have the skills to learn in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, because so many careers are being disrupted. And so we need to take the schools of the city and actually make them places where there can be classes at night to retrain adults to get new careers, and on weekends. So education to me is a lifelong thing. If we're gonna compete in a global economy and have people get skills throughout their lives to make them productive members of society, we have to really change the paradigm in education.
And it's going to be that, and then what about the financing? What do we do with that?
Financing.
Tax base
of the city?
Yeah. We don't have really time to even start it, but say
just very quickly, I mean, listen, you have unemployment in the city of 10%. If you get unemployment down below 5%, you have a much bigger tax base to pay for all these things. It's not a hard equation. Listen, I'm a big believer also in infrastructure rebuilding. And we go back to what Roosevelt did back in the 40s. If you rebuild the city and rebuild the state, and put people back to work, there'll be taxes flowing in, and you're building for the future. In the worst of times in this country's history, we've rebuilt our country. We should be doing that now.
Well, Tom, thank you. We've come to the end of this program, and I'm torn between saying I'm really sorry you're not running still, but also saying that 4 years from now I'll be there and I'd like to help you.
Thank you.
And I would like to see some of we need to have these things, so good luck to you to bring these issues
Thank
to
you
the
for
fore.
having me. Stay tuned.
Thanks, Tom. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.